Sierra Blanca, Texas, in the early 1900s, was a place where the wind never stopped blowing and the law often looked the other way. Perched near the arid edge of the Chihuahuan Desert, the town was more ghost than community, just a train stop, a scattering of shanties, and the low groan of cattle cars bound for slaughter. But at the heart of this forgotten place stood a leather tannery, built in 1905 by a man named Albin Sauer, a German immigrant with quiet eyes and calloused hands. The factory promised jobs, trade, and survival in an unforgiving land. Yet those who lived nearest to it swore they never saw anyone leave. The air stank with lye and iron. Stray dogs went missing. Travelers avoided the road after dusk. And between 1906 and 1913, at least 27 people, drifters, delivery boys, vagrants, and even a federal inspector, vanished without a trace within a 5-mile radius of that building. The sheriff chalked it up to bandits. The locals didn't ask questions, but the railway men whispered a different story. They spoke of Albin's late-night burnings, of the wet, fleshy smoke, of screams muffled behind tannery walls, and they spoke of a robe, stitched and hidden away, a grotesque relic said to grant the wearer power over flesh itself. When the tannery abruptly shut its doors in 1913, no announcement was made. Sauer simply disappeared. Years passed, dust buried the town, and the legend of the skin taker, half man, half myth, festered like a blister no one dared pop. It wasn't until 1972, when a local councilman petitioned to demolish the crumbling structure to make way for a rest stop, that the truth, or at least its skin, would be unearthed. As bulldozers tore through the factory floor, they struck a hidden basement chamber lined with rusted meat hooks, ritual markings, and a bundle of something that made hardened men retch: a robe, roughly human in shape, meticulous, sly-crafted, every patch a different shade, a different texture, stretch-marked, tattooed, freckled, tanned, pale. There were faces, nipples, fingertips. The stitching was done with sinew, and carved into the skin were Latin phrases, some biblical, others blasphemous. One repeated again and again, corpus est voluntas, the body is the will. Authorities sealed the site. News coverage was sparse, but the robe was taken to Austin for academic preservation, and no further public statement was issued. Sierra Blanca went quiet again, but some say the skin taker still walks, and not all the robe's pieces were found. The robe was not the only thing discovered beneath the tannery's foundation. As investigators, historians, and reluctant archivists descended on the site, more disturbing evidence emerged. In the same subterranean chamber, crudely carved wooden drawers were unearthed, each filled with remnants of what could only be described as trophies: human teeth sorted by size, locks of hair braided into tight coils, and jars filled with blackened fingernails suspended in a cloudy yellow fluid. One box contained children's shoes, dozens of them, all neatly arranged by length. The state forensic team, called in quietly under the pretense of archaeological interest, confirmed that at least 6 of the human skin panels in the robe came from children under the age of 10. Despite this, no charges were ever filed. Albin Sauer's name appeared in no further investigations. He was neither declared dead nor wanted. His immigration records disappeared from El Paso's archives, and most unsettling of all, a 1973 internal memo from the Texas Department of Public Safety, later leaked by a whistleblower, stated, "The craftsmanship implies extended knowledge of anatomy, tanning, and sacred ritual. This was not the work of one man." Locals who still remembered the tannery began to talk, quietly at first, and only to those they trusted. One woman, 92 at the time of the excavation, recalled being taken as a child to deliver biscuits to Mr. Albin once a month. He always wore gloves, she said, even when it was hot as sin, and he'd never touch the tin with his bare hands. Another elderly resident swore he once saw a group of men, none from town, arrive in black carriages at dusk and leave before sunrise, carrying long crates shrouded in cloth. The sheriff back then was paid to be blind, he muttered. These weren't rumors anymore, they were accounts, deposited like layers of flesh on the skin taker's lay. Gacy. By the late 70s, several small books and conspiracy columns began circulating. Some tied the tannery to pre-Christian European death cults. Others pointed to Mexican folklore of the Nahual, a shapeshifter who wore human skin to gain their essence. But the most disturbing theory, published in a banned thesis from Baylor University, proposed that the robe was a ritual vessel. When worn during specific lunar cycles, it allowed the wearer to not only become the stitched personas, but to absorb their memories, their sins, their desires. It wasn't about killing for pleasure, it was about becoming. In the months following the robe's discovery, a quiet panic began to ripple through certain academic circles. The University of Texas Anthropology Department had agreed to catalog and store the robe under strict archival conditions, but by the end of 1973, 3 researchers assigned to the project had resigned, each citing psychological distress in their exit reports. One doctoral candidate, Elizabeth Raines, was admitted to a private facility after reportedly carving Latin phrases into her arms, phrases identical to those found on the robe. She claimed she could hear the stitching breathe. Her notes, later sealed by court order, described dreams of walking barefoot through shallow water, surrounded by whispering voices that called her the vessel. Another researcher, Dr. Gordon Alvey, began exhibiting erratic behavior, lecturing his students while wearing latex sheets and reading excerpts from obscure Roman funeral rites. He was found dead in his office in early 1974, a scalpel embedded in his chest, with a single word scrawled on the wall behind him in dried blood: Libera. The university tried to distance itself. The robe, now euphemistically referred to in records as Textile Artifact 42A, was relocated to an undisclosed facility, rumored to be on federal property, but whispers persisted. One night, janitor, who briefly worked in the building where the robe had been stored, told a reporter that no matter how tightly he locked the archival chamber, the temperature inside would drop every night at 3:17 a.m., the same time the tannery fire alarm had first sounded in 1913. His statement was buried in a small local tabloid, but the timing was enough to ignite old suspicions. Meanwhile, back in Sierra Blanca, things began to stir again. The town, which had all but died in the decades since the tannery's closure, saw a sudden and bizarre uptick in disappearances. All's at first, then a pair of hitchhikers last seen near the old rail line. One local hunter claimed he stumbled on a figure wearing what looked like a hooded animal pelt in the dead of night, moving unnaturally through the desert brush. The thing didn't flee, it watched. Then it whispered something in what he described as dry, cracking Latin. The hunter, normally skeptical, moved his entire family out of town the next week without explanation. The skin-taker legend, once considered a folk tale for drunk cowboys and ghost tour pamphlets, was beginning to feel like a prophecy, and the robe, stitched in silence, was no longer content to rest. The unease in Sierra Blanca escalated into dread by 1975, when a Border Patrol officer named Martin Reyes vanished during a routine inspection of an abandoned boxcar less than 2 miles from the old tannery site. His body was never found, but his patrol vehicle was recovered with the engine still running and the driver's side door wide open. The seat was soaked, not with blood, but with a viscous amber-colored fluid that investigators couldn't identify. Beneath the passenger seat, they found a torn scrap of what appeared to be leather. Forensics later confirmed it was human skin, tanned and cured using 19th-century techniques. The local press barely covered the incident, but within certain corners of the Texas Highway Patrol and the Department of Homeland Security, a familiar term was scribbled into the margins of reports: skin-taker activity suspected. Desperate to quiet the growing hysteria, state officials arranged for the complete demolition and excavation of the tannery ruins under the guise of expanding a highway bypass. But when workers began digging deeper beneath the foundation, they uncovered something far older than brick or blood: concentric stone circles, partially collapsed tunnels, and a central altar carved from limestone. The altar bore glyphs not recognized by any of the on-site archaeologists, except one. Dr. Anna Greaves, a specialist in ancient funerary rites, froze when she saw the markings. She had seen similar symbols during a postdoctoral dig in Bavaria at the site of a 14th-century ossuary infamous for its so-called bone priesthood, a cult that believed wearing the remains of the dead granted eternal consciousness. Greaves tried to notify her department. Within 48 hours, she was relieved from the site. No explanation was given. Her published findings were redacted by the State Historical Society, but the altar was never removed. Locals say the excavation site was filled in hastily, covered with concrete, and fenced off. No historical marker was placed. Within weeks, signs warning of unstable ground appeared around the perimeter, and that should have been the end of it, except it wasn't. Ranchers a few miles out reported animals behaving erratically, herding in strange formations, facing toward the covered site at dusk, refusing to graze near it. A young girl disappeared from her backyard one night, and when search teams combed the area, they found a trail of footprints leading toward the old tannery grounds, but none leading back. The prints were bare, and the stride was impossibly long. Sierra Blanca had buried the tannery, but something beneath it had begun to stir. By 1976, the mood in Sierra Blanca had turned raw. Families that had lived in the area for generations began selling their land for pennies and moving east without looking back. Those who stayed became more guarded, keeping their children indoors after sunset and speaking in clipped whispers about the wind that speaks. Rumors circled about a former oil surveyor who set up camp near the old tannery site, claiming to be writing a book on spiritual metallurgy. He was found weeks later wandering Interstate 10, naked, sunburnt, and covered in strange symbols carved into his chest with what he said was a deer's jawbone. When authorities questioned him, he simply replied, "I walked the skin road, it showed me what lies between." He died in a mental facility 6 days later, choking on strips of notebook paper he'd torn from his journal. But it wasn't just Sierra Blanca. In academic circles, especially among those who had once studied the robe, subtle changes began to manifest. A professor at the University of New Mexico published a short-lived paper suggesting the robe was not merely a physical artifact, but a mnemonic device, each skin panel not just a body, but a memory cache. The human mind, he argued, could theoretically be imprinted into preserved skin tissue through high-trauma death, creating a living tome of suffering. The theory was dismissed, of course, until he, too, was found dead in his office, his face flayed, with a note beside his body that read, "Knowledge is hunger." Meanwhile, in El Paso, a series of arsons began targeting thrift stores, leather workshops, and butcher shops. Investigators found Latin inscriptions carved into floorboards left behind in each burned location, phrases identical to those on the robe. The fires formed a crescent arc around Sierra Blanca, as though someone, or something, was purging the land of unfinished work. Then, one night, a 911 call came from a ranch west of town. The woman on the line whispered frantically about a man in hides crawling across her roof, whispering the names of her children. Police arrived to find the house empty, no signs of forced entry, but a single, fleshy handprint, partially cured like leather, was discovered on the glass of the baby's crib. The infant was unharmed, but the mother was never seen again. For the few who still remembered the tannery, the implication was clear. The skin taker had never left. It had only been dormant, preserved, like leather, waiting for the right season or the right body. The robe, long hidden from the public and assumed locked away in some federal vault, resurfaced in whispers once again in late 1977, this time in the hands of a private collector. A former Smithsonian employee turned whistleblower claimed during a drunk interview at a DC bar that textile artifact 42A was no longer under government custody. According to him, the robe had been quietly deaccessioned, an internal term meaning it was sold or transferred without public disclosure. Who received it? The answer came in the form of a leaked shipping manifest sent to an anonymous Texas journalist. The recipient's name had been redacted, but the delivery address led to a private ranch in Marfa, Texas, just 90 miles from Sierra Blanca. a ranch owned by the Caro family, oil magnates known for their eccentric art collections and total reclusion. A month later, ranch hands on nearby properties began quitting en masse. They spoke of long, drawn-out howls at night, of seeing figures, tall, pale and twitching, watching from the ridgelines, sometimes mimicking the voices of their loved ones. One man described waking to find strips of what looked like dried human hide nailed to his barn door, arranged in a spiral pattern. He didn't pack a bag, he just drove and never came back. Then came the first confirmed death. A young geology student named Helena Maris, camping with classmates near Pinto Canyon, was found mutilated in a dry arroyo. Her body had been flayed, but not sloppily, carefully, ritually. A square of skin was missing from her back. No blood trail, no signs of a struggle, just one word carved into a rock above her body: Exordio, I am heard. Authorities remained tight-lipped, but one park ranger privately admitted the wound patterns matched those from the 1913 tannery files never made public. The implication was staggering. Not only had the skin-taker's methods rechewed, but they had been preserved with chilling precision, replicated, possibly even by someone studying those very documents. Either the robe was being worn again, or its influence was infectious. The borderlands had become a testing ground, and whatever lived in that stitched monstrosity was spreading, through blood, fear, and faith. Late that winter, an unmarked black van was seen parked outside a church in Sierra Blanca. The next morning, the pastor was gone, and the altar cloth had been replaced with a single panel of skin, stitched with the word, "Ascend it. He has risen." The skin taker was no longer just a legend, it was a doctrine, and someone, maybe many, were now preaching it. By early 1978, it became clear that whatever force was tied to the skin taker had evolved beyond a single figure. It had become a belief system, decentralized and viral. Reports emerged from as far as San Angelo and Del Rio. Cattle mutilations with surgical precision, Latin chants heard during blackouts, and strangers in thrifted robes standing silently outside rural churches until sunrise. At first, law enforcement dismissed these as drug-fueled hoaxes or the work of disaffected cultists. But then came the Pecos incident. On March 3rd, a family of 5 traveling west on Highway 20 vanished without a trace. Their van was found idling on the shoulder, doors wide open, radio softly playing classical music. All that remained was the family dog, alive, but shaved and painted head to toe in a red, ochre-like clay. Inside the van, investigators found fingernail-sized skin fragments tucked into the air vents, each piece inscribed with microscopic Latin phrases. They'd been deliberately inserted, each with surgical accuracy. The FBI launched a covert task force code-named Operant Skin, assigning a multidisciplinary team to track symbols and language patterns from the robe's inscriptions. One linguist, Dr. Adrian Key, began mapping the Latin phrases across various crime scenes and unearthed a disturbing revelation. The inscriptions weren't just quotes, they were instructions. Layered, recursive instructions, almost algorithmic in structure. Each line of skin, each phrase on the robe, built toward a larger message, one that, when read in sequence, described a process of spiritual transmutation through suffering. It was not a warning, it was a blueprint. Meanwhile, strange phenomena escalated around the site of the demolished tannery. Concrete laid over the sealed chamber had begun to crack, not from pressure beneath but from something within the material itself. Engineers described it as though the concrete was rotting. Plants near the fenced perimeter grew in abnormal, serpentine shapes. Cameras placed by a group of paranormal researchers malfunctioned consistently at 3:17 a.m., the same time the tannery's fire alarms had been triggered decades earlier. One video, recovered only partially, showed what appeared to be a naked figure slowly crawling on all fours around the site, its limbs bending the wrong way. The figure paused, turned to the camera, and smiled. It had no lips, just stretched skin stitched at the corners. In late spring, the mayor of Sierra Blanca resigned suddenly, stating only that, "There are old forces waking, and this town no longer belongs to men." His final act was to issue a midnight curfew and declare the tannery site off-limits under penalty of arrest. But no one enforced it, because by then the sheriff's office was empty and its doors were sealed with leather straps nailed into the frame, stitched in a spiral. That summer, Sierra Blanca became a ghost town in every way but name. The school shuttered quietly after several children reported seeing the man with no mouth standing outside the windows during recess. Parents stopped attending church. Even the train, once the lifeblood of the town, stopped making scheduled stops. Conductors reported equipment failures within a certain radius of the tannery site, lights flickering, brakes locking, voices coming through dead radios in slow, reversed Latin. One engineer quit mid-route after witnessing what he described as a procession of skin-draped figures walking along the tracks, swaying as if in prayer. In July, a group of documentarians from Austin arrived, hoping to make a low-budget horror film inspired by the skin-taker legend. They were warned off by locals but persisted, setting up camp near the eastern ridge. Within days, 2 crew members disappeared. The rest abandoned the project after their sound engineer was found hanging upside down from a mesquite tree, skinned from the waist up, a recorder strapped to his chest. The device, miraculously intact, captured 5 hours of audio. The last 30 minutes are nothing but breathing. Then, faintly, a phrase repeated in a child's voice, corpus est voluntas. The body is the will. Authorities no longer responded to calls from the area. The town's name was quietly removed from certain government maps. The electrical grid servicing Sierra Blanca began failing with no explanation, and yet people kept coming. Not tourists, not journalists, pilgrims, hooded figures who arrived in silence and wandered toward the tannery site as if summoned. Some were caught on wildlife cameras trudging barefoot through the desert at night, whispering prayers in dead languages. Others simply stood for hours in the blistering sun, unmoving, facing the concrete seal like mourners at a grave. No one knew who they were. None of them came back. And still, reports of the robe, textile artifact 42A, surfaced, not in museums, but in private collections. A Texas oil executive was found dead in his panic room, the only item missing, a display case containing what he'd called my shaman's coat. In Baton Rouge, a burned shipping container revealed remnants of tanned flesh and antique tailoring tools. The FBI denied involvement. The state coroner's report listed unclassified organic remains, but those who had studied the robe, what few remained, knew the truth. The skin-taker's work was never meant to be contained. It was meant to spread, one patch at a time, until its will was worn by many. And Sierra Blanca was no longer a single town. It was a nexus, a wound stitched into the earth, slowly pulling itself closed around us. The unraveling of Sierra Blanca's final layer came not from a ritual or a killing, but from an archive. In October of 1978, a box labeled simply 1909 Albin S. surfaced during renovations of the Hudspeth County Courthouse. Stored deep within a collapsed basement wall, the box contained brittle documents, soot-stained ledger books, and most chilling of all, a series of personal journals written in Albin Sauer's own hand. The entries began plainly: factory notes, supply orders, tanning schedules. But as the months progressed, the handwriting shifted, growing more erratic, smaller, looped like tendons stretched too tight. Then the language changed. English gave way to fractured German, then Latin, then something unrecognizable. Symbols resembling no alphabet, but described in a note as phonetic transcriptions for flesh. Sauer wrote of his calling, describing dreams in which a voice emerged from beneath the floorboards, whispering in rhythms that felt like breathing. He spoke of the stain beneath the stone, a spirit without body, awaiting shape. He called it Induratus, the hardened one. But the most damning entry was dated December 11, 1912, months before the tannery shut down. In it, Sauer confessed that the robe was nearly complete, not just an art piece or a ritual garment, but a cocoon. Each panel represented a passage, a voice, a scream made immortal through preservation. When the lining is sealed, he wrote, the breath will return. It will wear me as I have worn it. This was no metaphor. Sauer believed that by stitching together the pain, flesh, and soul of others, he could forge a vessel strong enough to contain something inhuman, a consciousness older than history, hidden in blood. He was not killing for power. He was preparing a skin for something else to step into. A week after the journals were discovered, the courthouse where they had been stored burned to the ground. No arson suspect was ever identified. Only a melted steel drawer handle was recovered, wrapped in what looked like charred leather, fused to the metal like a handshake. The fire destroyed all but one page of the journal, now encased in glass at an undisclosed private collection. It reads, "The body remembers, the body obeys. When the last stitch is pulled, the silence will end." And perhaps it already had, for in the days after the fire, residents across the county reported seeing flayed animals neatly arranged in spirals outside their doors. Some found teeth in their mailboxes. One woman received a child's shoe filled with ash. The robe, or what was left of it, was no longer just a cursed object, it was a transmitter, and Sierra Blanca was its broadcast. As winter descended in 1978, what remained of Sierra Blanca transformed into a place out of time, its dust-blown streets lifeless by day and charged with an unnatural stillness by night. The few remaining families boarded up windows with crucifixes, animal bones, or in some cases, skin from slaughtered livestock arranged into wards. These makeshift charms, passed down from desert folklore, were desperate gestures against something far older than superstition. Reports of sightings became more grotesque. Figures with arms too long for their torsos seen crawling backward through drainage culverts, faces glimpsed through car windows that had no eyes, just taut, smooth skin pulled tight like cured hide, and always, always, the scent of lye and copper drifting in the air. But what truly terrified the remaining residents wasn't what they saw, it was what they began to hear, inside their own homes. Inside their own heads, rhythms, humming, the sound of someone sewing, always just in the next room. One man, a retired welder named Luis Orta, shot himself in the chest after reportedly locking himself in his storm shelter for 4 days. His final note was written directly onto the concrete floor in chalk, "I am being threaded." Federal authorities declared Sierra Blanca a hazard zone in January of 1979, citing soil instability and electromagnetic disturbances as the reason for a forced evacuation. A massive perimeter was installed around the tannery ruins and maintained by unnamed private contractors. Surveillance towers went up, helicopters circled irregularly. But despite the silence in the press, files continued to leak. One aerial photograph taken weeks after the quarantine showed an impossible structure built around the sealed chamber, spirals carved into the concrete, widening outward like some immense sigil etched with earth-moving machinery. The robe, presumed lost or destroyed, was now believed to have been placed at the spiral's center, according to a redacted Defense Intelligence memo. Whatever was once dormant was now being studied, or worshipped. In parallel, whispers of the skin taker began to surface across the country. A ritual murder in Maine bore the same pattern of flaying. A child in Arizona drew symbols from Sauer's journal without ever being taught them. A preacher in Arkansas tore the skin from his own arms during a sermon, shouting, "The vessel must be worthy." It was no longer about a man or a robe or a town swallowed by ritual. The skin taker had become a language written in blood, carried by breath, stitched into minds through fear. Sierra Blanca had opened the door, and somewhere across the dust and silence, something had stepped through. The phenomenon was no longer isolated. By spring of 1979, patterns of behavior, ritualistic, obsessive, violent, began echoing across the American interior. The Department of Justice quietly launched Project Emberglass, a multi-agency investigation tasked with tracking symbolic crime clusters tied to the skin taker's mythology. Over 100 incidents were recorded within a 3-month span: skin removal without mutilation, phrases carved into living flesh, and individuals found in fugue states, repeating words never taught. The terrifying commonality: none of the perpetrators remembered committing the acts. They all reported hearing the rhythm, a steady pulling, like thread through cloth. But what investigators failed to grasp was that these were not just crimes, they were rehearsals. Across state lines, people began gathering, unaffiliated by blood, location, or ideology, in basements, in cornfields, in burned-out tenements. Strangers with no prior connection were discovered sewing together scraps of animal hide, whispering prayers in languages older than Latin. In Iowa, an abandoned meatpacking plant was raided by local police who found a dozen naked men kneeling in a circle, each wearing stitched masks made from pigskin. They offered no resistance. Their mouths had been sewn shut. Each bore the same scar pattern across their backs, a spiral made of healed incisions, flanked by two stitched words, expecta corpus, await the body. The implication hit federal agents with the weight of prophecy. The robe had never been the final vessel. It was a prototype, a template, a sacred garment through which the skin taker could learn, practice, replicate, and now outsource. And somewhere, someone, or something, was using it to build something larger. Back in Sierra Blanca, the perimeter remained sealed, but motion sensors began failing. Trail cams placed by curious locals perturbed frames that chilled even hardened skeptics. In one, a figure stands in perfect stillness at the edge of the frame, blurry yet unmistakable, a humanoid form covered head to toe in patchwork leather, arms outstretched in what appears to be a cruciform stance. In another, symbols begin to appear carved into the dirt itself, shifting night by night, rearranging into something that looked eerily like a map. And then, the dreams began. Not just for those near the site, but hundreds, perhaps thousands across the country. Shared dreams. Dreams of a faceless man walking through corridors of skin, gently tugging at the seams of the dreamer's chest. People began waking up with bruises in spiral patterns. Some bled from their navels, some awoke mid-sentence, whispering the same phrase across dozens of states. It is almost stitched. Whatever had been gestating beneath Sierra Blanca was not just alive, it was spreading. The skin taker had become a contagion of memory and ritual, and the body was nearly ready. In June of 1979, a breakthrough, or perhaps a warning, came from an unexpected source, a 14-year-old boy named Milo Fenn from Amarillo, Texas. Milo had never been to Sierra Blanca. He had no known connection to anyone involved with the robe or its mythology, but one night he was found standing barefoot in the middle of Interstate 40, unresponsive, with symbols drawn in charcoal across his chest and arms. When authorities took him into custody, he began to speak, not in his own voice, but in a raspy, aged tone, reciting perfect Latin for over an hour. A university professor brought in to transcribe the speech confirmed that the boy had repeated a series of invocations used during a 17th century Venetian necromantic rite. One phrase stood out: vestis non geritur, gignitur. The garment is not worn, it is born. Medical examinations revealed something far more disturbing. Beneath Milo's skin, particularly along his spine and ribcage, MRI scans showed an intricate pattern of scar tissue forming an internal spiral, one that was biologically impossible to explain without prior surgical intervention. The boy's parents swore he'd never undergone any operations. One nurse, shaken and later dismissed from the case, claimed she saw movement beneath the boy's skin, as if something were being pulled taut from the inside. Milo never spoke again. He was institutionalized in a federal psychiatric ward, and access to his case was sealed. But news of the incident leaked, as it always does. Within weeks, forums, shortwave radio cults, and fringe newsletters were ablaze with new theories. That the robe had begun replicating itself not through cloth or stitching, but through the human body. That each act of ritual, each flaying or carving or dream shared across distances, was not symbolic, it was generative. The robe, they said, was no longer a garment at all. It had become a cellular pattern, then a metaphysical virus. And then came the blackout. On July 3, 1979, every camera, motion sensor and monitoring device within a 5-mile radius of the Sierra Blanca tannery site went dead at exactly 3:17 a.m., the infamous hour of the original tannery fire. Satellite footage from the same time showed a brief, circular pulse of heat at the location, followed by a perfect stillness. No birds, no wind, no motion at all. When a team of contractors was dispatched the next morning, they found the outer fence ripped from the ground, not torn, but peeled upward like a flap of skin. No footprints, no tire tracks. Inside the fence, the spiral was gone. In its place was a shallow basin of hardened black soil, perfectly round, as if something massive had been lifted from the earth and carried away. But what chilled the investigators most was what they didn't find. No trace of the robe. No bones, no altar, no signs of life. Just one word, freshly carved into the concrete foundation beneath the soil. Ambulavit. He has walked. The vessel had left its cradle, and no one knew where it was going. In the weeks following the Sierra Blanca blackout, strange events began to surface with disturbing consistency across the American Southwest. Not in clusters, but in a spiraling pattern, radiating outward from the vanished tannery site like shockwaves beneath the surface of the earth. In Las Cruces, New Mexico, a morgue technician resigned after discovering a cadaver that had somehow been resewn, with incisions not made by scalpels, but by something more primitive. The stitching was too tight, too precise. Skin had been folded, rearranged, and repurposed. The corpse's own fingerprint no longer matched its file. A similar event occurred in Flagstaff, Arizona, where a coroner found a faint inscription carved into the underside of a man's tongue. Porta est in carne. The gate is in the flesh. Hospitals began reporting a sharp uptick in cases involving unexplained skin disorders, thickening, discoloration, or peeling in spiral patterns. In some, the dermis began to detach from the subcutaneous layer in clean, uniform sections, like a seam being loosened from the inside. But these patients exhibited no pain. Only one common symptom, recurring dreams of being threaded by a faceless woman who whispered the names of those they had wronged. Several patients disappeared from their hospital beds entirely, their gowns left folded in spirals atop the mattress. No security footage ever showed them leave. Amid these events, a clandestine tape began circulating among underground circles. Known only as Tape 13, it was allegedly leaked from the Project Emberglass task force. It opens with distorted footage of a man standing in a dimly lit room, his back to the camera. Latin chants echo softly in the background. The man begins to undress, revealing what appears to be a complete dermal suit stitched into his own body. As the chanting swells, he turns. His face is not his own. It is a mass. Made of many, sewn together at the mouth and eyes. He lifts his hand and slowly points to the camera. The tape cuts. Experts who examined the footage noted an absence of natural blinking and a distortion in body proportions, as if the man were wearing more than just skin. The metadata tags on the file contain only one word, induratus. The implication sent waves of panic through the remaining researchers. Albin Sauer's journals had not been the ravings of a lunatic, they were instructions. The skin taker, this ancient force of will and flesh, had never intended to remain within a single body. It was building a host that could walk among many, a patchwork prophet, a moving doctrine, and somewhere along the desert highways, along cracked motel mirrors and dry riverbeds, sightings began again. A tall figure, hunched, silent, always facing away, and when it turned, there was no mouth, only the faint line of stitches. The skin taker was walking, not to be seen, but to be worn. By late July of 1979, the sightings became harder to dismiss. Emergency radio broadcasts, shortwave dispatches, and underground zines, once dismissed as fringe paranoia, began aligning with shocking precision. Reports from Oklahoma, Nevada, and northern Mexico all described the same figure. Tall, cloaked in a sun-bleached duster or cloak, moving slowly and barefoot through desolate places. Truckers told of a man walking the shoulder of remote highways, head tilted unnaturally to one side, dragging something long and limp behind him, something that twitched. Park rangers, hardened by years of exposure to the worst of human wilderness, quit without notice after encountering the figure in silence, describing the overwhelming stench of rotting leather and the sensation that they were being measured, not watched. One encounter, recorded on a reel-to-reel by an amateur paranormal investigator near Deming, New Mexico, captured the exact moment the entity stepped into view. At first, only the sound of wind and cicadas filled the audio, then a wet, slapping footstep, then another, then a whisper, not into the microphone, but inside it, a whisper that bypassed physical acoustics and rattled the tape's magnetic strip. The words were clear. "I am worn by need." The investigator fled. His camera, found days later, had melted. The skin taker's influence wasn't limited to physical manifestation. Cults began to blossom in its wake, small, rootless gatherings of the devout who referred to themselves as the seam. They spoke of the re-stitching, a time when all individual bodies would be loosened, unwound, and re-threaded into one collective garment, an eternal vessel stitched in sin and silence. In a grainy photograph mailed anonymously to the Amarillo Gazette, 3 members of the seam are seen standing in a crop circle, naked and blindfolded, each with their lips sewn shut, branded into their chests, a spiral of teeth. And still, Sierra Blanca remained sealed. But even that threshold was cracking. A Border Patrol chopper flying near the perimeter caught thermal footage that contradicted the known geography. Something massive pulsing beneath the ground, like a sleeping heart beating once every 13 minutes. A retired geologist studying the footage described it as a heat signature too intelligent to be geological. Elsewhere, a man in Roswell woke to find perfect rows of human molars embedded in the walls of his bedroom, spelling out one phrase: "He is the lining." In Tulsa, a librarian checking out a dusty tome on Latin liturgy found the final page replaced with a strip of cured skin, upon which was burned, "His will is fitted." No longer a legend, no longer a relic. The skin taker had become a system, one stitched through ritual, trauma, and willing sacrifice. And now it was no longer trying to enter the world. It had already arrived, and it was being welcomed. The descent reached a new depth in August of 1979, when a declassified transmission, marked top secret and scrambled under the codename Velvet Seam, was leaked to a fringe journalist in New Orleans. The contents were staggering: a heavily redacted transcript between 3 federal agents stationed outside the former Sierra Blanca perimeter, and a voice intercepted via low-frequency radio. The voice did not identify itself. It spoke without accent, devoid of inflection. It addressed each agent by name, including their childhood injuries and the names of their grandmothers. Then it said simply, "I am the remembered wound. I am being tailored." The feed went dead. All 3 agents were placed on indefinite psychiatric leave within 24 hours. One reportedly removed all the skin from his hands with a paring knife, saying, "I was touched. I must unwear it." In response, the Department of Defense initiated Operation Downline, deploying experimental surveillance drones equipped with thermal scanners and magnetic resonance over the basin where the tannery once stood. What they recorded over a 5-day span was never officially released, but a disgraced radar technician who handled the data revealed a single frame, a colossal form, 200 feet across, stitched from interlocking patterns of what looked like tendons and straps, coiled deep beneath the surface. It was not moving, it was forming, not just growing in size, but refining itself, organizing, as if the spiral had gone from symbol to organ. Meanwhile, an epidemic of self-harm cases erupted across Texas and neighboring states. These weren't ordinary suicide attempts. Victims were carving themselves in patterns, deliberate spirals, geometric flays, dermal tattoos of Latin text. Many of them reported no pain, no motive, just an overwhelming urge to loosen the seams. In Houston, a woman walked into a church completely nude, except for a corset of dried sinew around her abdomen, sewn into her own skin. She collapsed at the altar and whispered before dying, he fits so well." Religious leaders began to fracture. Some denounced the events as demonic. Others claimed it was prophecy fulfilled. A small faction of clergy in West Texas began incorporating phrases from the skin taker's robe into their sermons, claiming the flesh was God's oldest scripture. They were quickly excommunicated, but not before recordings surfaced of them performing sacraments in stitched vestments, pouring blood into goblets carved from bone. And through it all, sightings continued, but they changed. The figure was no longer always alone. Witnesses began reporting pairs, sometimes trios, of skin-taker-like forms, each bearing distinct patches. A woman's tattooed shoulder, a child's freckled cheek, a man's hairy knuckles. It had replicated, not copied, but multiplied through human participation, like a choir wearing many voices. The robe had never been meant to hold one soul. It had always been a chorus robe. The skin-taker wasn't just walking anymore, it was assembling, and the body being built wasn't for a man, it was for something older than flesh, something that had waited, patiently, to be sewn back into the world, stitch by willing stitch. September 1979 marked a turning point, not in the unraveling of the known, but in the acceptance of the unknown. The fabric between myth and reality had been thinned to translucent gossamer. In cities far removed from Sierra Blanca, strange ritual patterns began appearing in public spaces, a spiral of fingernail clippings in a New York subway, flayed animal pelts nailed to the ceiling of a Las Vegas hotel ballroom, each bearing inscriptions from Sauer's original journal. These acts were not isolated, they were coordinated, or worse, they were instinctive. The seam had grown. What had started as fractured cults had become a decentralized communion. No leader, no temple, just a shared language carved into flesh and spread through whispers. Federal agencies lost track of them. The seam had no names, no bank accounts, no homes, but they had purpose. They traveled in silence, rarely in groups larger than 3, leaving behind spirals in bone, tooth and blood. And they watched, always watched. In a chilling report from a retired rail inspector near Tucumcari, New Mexico, a boxcar was found sealed with melted leather cords. Inside were no bodies, just hundreds of surgical blades, bone chisels, and tanning agents. Along the interior walls, one word repeated again and again in burnt skin: "He returns." The inspector, upon discovering it, suffered a massive seizure and later spoke only in reversed Latin until his death 3 weeks later. But the most terrifying signal came not from the field, but from a machine. A group of technicians maintaining NOAA weather satellites reported a sudden anomaly in thermal patterns above the southwest. For 13 nights in a row, an intricate spiral appeared in atmospheric heat signatures above Sierra Blanca at exactly 3:17 a.m. No cloud movement, no storms, just a massive circular bloom of warmth that pulsed once, then disappeared. Meteorologists tried to blame it on equipment malfunction, but one in turn cross-referenced the spiral's shape with an ancient Sumerian burial diagram. It matched, exactly. And then came the child. In Amarillo, a 5-year-old girl was found sitting alone outside a diner at dawn. She was mute, hairless, covered in a strange grey powder that smelled like lime and ash. Medical records showed no trauma, no injury, no identity. When shown flashcards of animals, she pointed to sheep and whispered her first word: "Offered." When asked where she came from, she lifted her shirt to reveal a perfect spiral branded into her belly. That same night, the mayor of Amarillo received a small parcel wrapped in cured leather. Inside was a strip of flesh inscribed with the town's name and a single phrase in curled black script: "Stitch the child, he needs a lining." The robe was no longer a relic. The vessel was no longer theoretical. The seam had begun preparing hosts, and whatever walked in their patchwork shadow was not merely coming. It had begun measuring the world, inch by inch, for its final fitting. By the autumn equinox of 1979, the atmosphere itself seemed to shift, dense with a stillness that pressed into the skin like wet cloth. People described the sensation of being watched, not from above or afar, but from within. Mirrors became suspect, shadows felt stitched to their feet, and for those who had heard the stories, or worse, believed them, dreams no longer provided escape. They awoke weeping, skins sore in the shape of spirals, whispering fragments of languages they had never studied. Latin, yes, but also others, forgotten tongues sewn into the dreamer's throat like a gag slowly unraveling. Then came the crescendo event. On September 23rd, exactly at 3:17 a.m., across 13 states and parts of northern Mexico, every emergency frequency spiked with the same static pulse. Hospitals reported synchronized heart rate disruptions in intensive care units. Electric clocks froze on 3:17. In remote corners of Arizona, radios that weren't plugged in began to hum. One CB radio operator recorded what he believed to be a weather warning, only to play it back and hear his own voice repeating, "Let me in, I am your second skin." He slit his wrists in the shape of a spiral and was found days later, skin peeled upward from his knuckles as if being loosened by invisible hands. In Corpus Christi, an entire wedding party vanished. 17 guests, including the bride and groom, left behind only clothing arranged in deliberate spirals on the reception floor. Surveillance footage showed the guests standing still mid-toast, lifting their glasses in unison and whispering something in unison. Then they vanished, frame by frame, without any visible movement. The champagne glasses remained floating for a fraction of a second before crashing down. The footage was erased from police archives within 72 hours, but a still frame made it to the press. 17 guests, mouths sewn shut in PO. Some production, staring directly into the lens. The seam had become bolder. They began leaving behind templates, instructional patterns, etched into bus stop benches, sketched in chalk on playgrounds, carved into livestock. These patterns weren't threats, they were invitations. In Kansas, a local news station unknowingly aired a children's PSA that, when played backwards, contained whispered surgical instructions in Latin. 2 days later, a boy was found attempting to flay his own thigh with a ruler, repeating, "Measure me, mend me," and still, Sierra Blanca lay quiet, sealed. But beneath that silence, something rhythmic pulsed through the fault lines, a low hum that rattled machinery and bones alike. Surveyors who trespassed into the basin heard it echo through their chests, not in their ears, but in their ribs. One fled screaming that he could hear the stitching, the other never came back. The robe had been a beginning, the seam was the needle, and now the world itself, its memories, its bodies, its sleepers, was becoming the cloth. The skin taker was not inhabiting humanity, it was tailoring it for something vast, something final, something ready to be worn. October ushered in the harvest season, but across the afflicted territories there was no reaping, only unmaking. In towns as far apart as Lubbock, El Paso, and Santa Fe, crops rotted overnight in intricate concentric spirals. Wheat turned black, corn silk wove itself into knots, orchards bore fruit with no seeds, their skins marked with strange calligraphy that bled when pierced. Farmers began to speak of a blight not born of drought or pest, but of proximity to him. They didn't use the name. By then, no one did. They only called him the wearer. And in whispered tones, they feared not his face, but his fit. That month, 17 women across Texas and New Mexico were admitted to emergency rooms complaining of labor pains. None were pregnant. All experienced contractions. All screamed of being unzipped. Several had identical spiral scars appear along their abdomens within hours of admission. One woman, a devout Catholic from Alpine, delivered nothing but a bloodied length of twine from between her legs. Doctors could not explain how it had entered her body. She died days later, muttering, "He threads the motherless." Then came the vocal events. In Phoenix, entire neighborhoods reported hearing voices not from outside, but through the walls. Not whispers, sewing instructions, verbs like cleave, twist, bind, and feed. In Amarillo, a teenager burst his own eardrums trying to silence the sound of wet hands clapping inside his skull. And in Marfa, a preacher recorded a sermon in which his voice was replaced, on playback, with what linguists determined was layered audio of 47 different people, all speaking in unison from one larynx. They said only, "He is not worn, he is worn through." Something ancient was no longer stepping into the world. It was being expressed through it, through acts, through mouths, through bodies reshaped into script. The seam's activities escale, aided in both intricacy and confidence. In a Dallas parking garage, 108 rats were found dissected and sewn together into a perfect humanoid form, seated cross-legged in prayer. Its stitched eyelids bore the phrase, "awaiting fit." In a motel in Tucson, a man was found dead, his chest hollowed out and lined with velvet. Inside, a note, "He will rest in me soon." And still, the dreams continued. Some claimed they'd begun dreaming in reverse. Others said they'd stopped dreaming altogether, replaced instead by memoryless hours of silence, in which they awoke wet with sweat and blood, surrounded by torn linens arranged into symbols they couldn't understand. By Halloween, the veil between legend and life was threadbare. Children in costume were found mimicking rituals unknowingly, drawing spirals in glue and ash, speaking nursery rhymes whose rhymes traced Sauer's journal entries word for word. One boy, dressed as a surgeon, approached his mother with a sharpened spoon and said, "Time to let the lining out." He didn't remember saying it, but she remembered what came next. The wearer was no longer a myth or even a man. He was becoming a property of the world itself, a pressure in the seams of culture, a force that did not invade but unfolded like skin too long stitched shut, now peeling open to show something waiting, something always waiting, and now nearly dressed. As the final days of 1979 crawled into November, the temperature across vast stretches of the Southwest dropped unexpectedly, not just in degrees, but in atmosphere. Rooms felt colder than the air itself. Thermometers registered normalcy, but breath fogged indoors. Metal warped subtly. Fluorescent lights dimmed without flickering. And across Sierra Blanca's old fault lines, where concrete still sealed the tannery's basin like a scar, the land began to hum. Not audibly, but at a frequency that registered in molars and marrow. People stopped sleeping. Or worse, they began waking up in the wrong places. In Fort Stockton, a nurse was found unconscious in the hospital's basement morgue, naked and cocooned in her own bedsheets, stitched shut with surgical suture. She had no memory of descending the 5 flights of stairs. She only said, "I followed the pull. I was ready to be worn." In El Paso, a retired priest hung himself from the bell tower of his church, but not before carving the phrase, "Vestis est anima." The garment is the soul, into every pew. His final sermon, discovered on cassette, was a guttural, hissing whisper that, when reversed, formed a seamless monologue, an instruction manual for harvesting skin without breaking the spirit beneath it. The voice was not his. And then the bodies started to disappear. Not new ones, old ones. Graves across Texas were found disturbed, not dug up, but opened from within. Some coffins lay empty, others held garments made from stitched-together burial shrouds. A forensic pathologist, analyzing a reinterred corpse, found something horrifying inside the chest cavity, a folded piece of skin, wrapped like a letter, inked with bile and old blood. It simply read, "This lining is retired." The seam began moving east. In Louisiana, a train derailment uncovered a hidden compartment in a freight car filled with hundreds of gloves, each made for a different human hand. In Georgia, a skinless deer was nailed upright against a barn wall in the shape of a man, with buttons sewn where its eyes had once been. And in a children's hospital in Birmingham, a young patient with no prior trauma began screaming uncontrollably, pointing at her own IV line and yelling, "He's pulling the thread, he's unmaking me." Those who had tried to track the robe now realized the truth. It was never the final vessel, it was the pattern. A prototype for something evolutionary. Every spiral, every carving, every flaying had stitched together not just flesh, but belief. The skin-taker's theology had metastasized, seamless, viral, omnipresent. No longer a tale passed in whispers, it had entered language itself, encoding itself in symbols, dreams, gestures. One linguist working with the emberglass remnants compared it to a semantic virus. A meme with muscle, a script written into culture through trauma and repetition until enough minds spoke it, enough hands reenacted it, and the garment could be born again, not on one body, but through all bodies. The skin taker no longer needed Sierra Blanca. He no longer needed Albin Sauer's robe. He had found new lining, new flesh, and it spoke his name through every silence, every spiral, every soul waiting to be threaded into the great collective hide. The world wasn't watching him walk. The world was becoming his skin. By mid-November 1979, it became clear that containment had failed, not just geographically but philosophically. The skin taker legend had become infrastructure, hidden in backmasked vinyl tracks, etched into school chalkboards by unknowing hands, appearing in the accidental folds of newspaper creases that, when unfolded just right, formed the unmistakable spiral. This wasn't a haunting, it was a possession of systems, symbols, and sentience. Inside a Colorado mental facility, a patient with no history of violence drew a perfect anatomical rendering of the human nervous system, stitched together with thread. She'd never studied anatomy. Her doctors noted that each organ had been labeled not in English but in a dialect of Proto-Latin used only by necroscribes in the Roman catacombs. The drawing's title, Corpus Quae. When asked what it meant, she simply replied, "He's tuning us." Meanwhile, across abandoned stretches of Route 66, hitchhikers vanished without a trace. The few who escaped told nearly identical stories. A driver in an old sedan, face obscured by a sheer veil of tightly woven flesh, who offered no words but played a soft clicking sound through the radio. They described the sensation of being watched from inside their own bodies, as if their bones had started to hum. Most disturbing of all, each survivor bore a new scar after the encounter, a small, nearly invisible spiral at the base of the neck, as if something had threaded them in sleep. In academic circles, suppressed documents resurfaced. Sauer's original tannery designs, now believed to be based on sacred geometry, intended not for industry but for invocation. The vats, the belts, even the drainage tunnels beneath the foundation, all aligned with bone chime diagrams found in ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats. The tannery wasn't a factory, it was a loom, and the robe was its first act of speech. Cultural. Events began to fracture. A high school play in San Antonio halted mid-performance when all 22 students simultaneously began reciting lines from the robe's inscriptions, none of which were in the script. Their voices harmonized in perfect dissonance. When asked afterward, they had no memory of it. In St. Louis, a radio host went live at midnight and recited a recipe for tanning human flesh with the calm cadence of a cooking segment. When confronted, he wept, not for his mistake, but because he could finally hear the rhythm. And then, a seismic shift. Seismologists recorded a subterranean vibration emanating not from the Earth's tectonic plates, but from within the crust, a pulse every 13 minutes, aligned perfectly with the hour of 3:17 a.m. It had no known origin, no measurable fault, but when graphed over time, the pulses formed a pattern, a spiral, unfolding slowly like something stretching its limbs. At last, the skin taker's intent was no longer questioned. He was not a ghost, nor a god. He was an archetype, resurrected through ritual, encoded into flesh, now echoing through the nervous system of a species that had unknowingly become his loom. And the robe was not a warning, it was the first verse in a garment meant to dress a world. Each disappearance, each whispered phrase, each scar in the shape of a spiral wasn't an ending, it was a stitch, and as the months waned and the year neared its end, one message wove itself across every border, belief, and body: he is nearly done. As December 1979 settled its cold across the heart of America, a new kind of silence emerged. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of a pause. People stopped asking questions. News reports ceased their bizarre incident coverage, not because events had ended, but because editors began receiving packages, small bundles wrapped in wax paper, each containing a strip of leather, a name, and a date. Most complied, a few didn't. Their articles went to print anyway. They were never seen again. The printers, however, kept rolling, spitting out pages with altered headlines, rewritten by unseen hands. One chilling example, a small-town column originally titled "The Missing Boy of Winter Creek" went to press as "He is Among Us, a Good Fit." In Minneapolis, snow melted in spiral formations across public parks. In Arkansas, entire flocks of birds were found plucked and arranged in a sequence resembling vertebrae. No predators, no blood, just stillness and intention. And then came the concordance tapes, mailed anonymously to libraries, churches, and universities across the country. These unmarked cassettes contained hours of audio, flesh being pulled, whispered sewing prayers, and sometimes disturbingly melodic chanting. One librarian in Topeka transcribed her copy and realized it matched perfectly the rhythm of her own breathing. Another in Boise claimed to hear her dead father's voice on the tape, repeating one phrase endlessly, "Stitch me in, daughter, I miss the warmth." A team of disillusioned Emberglass operatives, now working independently, attempted to map the cumulative spiral pattern across affected regions. The result was staggering, a massive, slowly widening spiral across North America, each event a stitch in a continental cloak. The center point, predictably, aligned with Sierra Blanca, but the outer edge was moving east, as if wrapping. Meanwhile, the seam made a rare public appearance. In New Orleans, under the guise of a performance art collective, they held an exhibition called Living Lining. Audience members watched in silence as veiled figures slowly stitched and unstitched each other in absolute synchronization. At the crescendo, one seam member stepped forward, opened their chest to reveal a transparent window of skin, and inside something moved. The audience screamed. No footage was recovered, but witnesses agreed on one detail. There were fingernails inside, tapping against the glass from the inside, as if begging to be let out, or let in. In D.C., one senator's aide attempted to leak classified findings from the robe investigation. Before he could, he was found dead, his skin entirely intact but loosened from the muscle beneath, like a glove gently pulled back. On the wall, scrawled in his own flayed fingertips, were the words, "He wore me gently." The final realization came slowly, like a cold dawn. The skin taker had never been waiting to return. He had been growing, not in flesh, but in language, in ritual, in memory. Each act of horror wasn't a manifestation of him. It was him stitching himself into the world not as a ghost, not as a demon, but as a suit of collective belief. And with the spiral complete in the coming weeks, all that remained was to put him on. As 1979 neared its bitter end, a sense of finality hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't rise. December's nights grew unnaturally still across the Midwest and Southwest, as if the wind itself had been cauterized. Entire towns began operating in a twilight state, open signs left unlit, curtains permanently drawn, schools technically open but barely attended. People didn't talk about it, they felt it. A tension, not in the sky or the soil, but in their own bodies, a tightening at the base of the spine, a flutter behind the sternum, as though something inside them was being measured, or worse, tailored. On December 14th, a Black Friday mall crowd in Dallas froze mid-step. Hundreds of shoppers halted in perfect stillness for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Security footage showed all motion cease at once. Escalators stopped, carousels froze, fountains halted mid-arc. When movement resumed, no one remembered anything, but 73 individuals later developed a spiral-shaped rash around their chests, and several were admitted to psychiatric units after claiming they heard the mannequins whispering the stitching order. Elsewhere, the seam intensified their work. In a grain silo in Nebraska, investigators discovered a lattice of human hair stretching wall to wall, threaded with teeth and dried eyelids like beads on a rosary. In Detroit, subway passengers reported faceless figures dragging long lengths of blood-wet cloth across empty platforms, humming lullabies in reverse. But no bodies were ever found, only fibers, always fibers. Then came the false bleedings. Across 3 continents, individuals unaffiliated with the US events began to wake up soaked in blood, not their own, not from injuries, but from their bedding, their ceilings, their walls. The blood spiraled outward from their bodies in precise, almost beautiful formations. Many said they had dreamt of walking barefoot down a hallway lined with leather curtains. At the end, they saw a mirror, and in it, not themselves, but a patchwork face smiling. One woman in Marseille described it as, "My body fitted on someone else's bones." The global nature of the events shattered the last hope of containment. language patterns, dreams, even religious iconography began to bend. Priests in Poland began referring to the Seamless One. A mosque in Cairo reported calligraphic distortions in ancient Quranic scrolls, subtle curling symbols that resembled spirals when mirrored. The Vatican released a one-line memo: "The robe is universal, pray it remains unfastened," and beneath it all, always, was 3:17 a.m., the time of quiet pulsing, of mirror warping, of phones ringing with no call traced, of staircases where extra steps appeared in the dark. One former government psychic, long since dismissed as unstable, reported receiving a single mental transmission that month: "Try me on, you have always been my size." December 31st approached, and somewhere in Sierra Blanca, beneath concrete and dust, the spiral had finished. Not just on the land, but on time itself. A pattern woven across calendars and clocks. The final stitch was ready. Midnight would not mark a new year, it would mark a fitting. New Year's Eve, 1979. Across the globe, millions prepared to usher in a new decade, but in the spiraled shadows of Sierra Blanca and the wide, haunted net that had spread from it, something else stirred, something not aligned with celebration or calendar, but with the moment the world became tight enough to wear. At precisely 3:17 a.m. Central Time, an hour long dismissed as coincidence, as myth, a phenomenon rippled outward, silent and unseen, yet felt by every sensitive nerve and dreaming mind. Clocks stopped, not all, just a few, enough to notice. Radios emitted a soft thrum, like muscle against muscle. Children across 6 countries sat up in their beds simultaneously and whispered words no parent understood, each ending with the same phrase: "He walks in me now." In a security tower overlooking the sealed Sierra Blanca perimeter, a guard assigned to watch nothing but emptiness began to scream. When his backup arrived, they found his eyes gone. Not gouged, but peeled, like decals removed from glass. On the wall behind him, drawn in his own blood, was a detailed diagram of the robe's stitching, updated, expanded, and complete. The guard had never seen the original pattern. Then came the signal, not technological, biological, tactile. Across the spiral states, hundreds of people awoke to the sensation of pressure, not pain, not movement, just a soft pulling across their skin, as though someone were gently fitting them into something invisible. Some reported the feeling of threads tightening along their backs. One man in Tulsa awoke to find every mole on his body had shifted into a precise spiral around his navel. A woman in Flagstaff bled from her fingertips, not from cuts, but from openings, thread-shaped, clean. The seam, now indistinguishable from myth, movement and machine, activated its final wave. They did not chant, they did not gather, they waited, their bodies becquet. Aim looms, their breath became hymns, and at 3:17 a.m. every known member vanished, not fled, not hidden, gone. All that remained were their vestments, robes stitched from unknown fibers, folded and placed carefully in the spiral shape, each bearing a tag with one name, Induratus, the hardened one, and then silence. Not peace, not stillness, silence like the world had inhaled and refused to let go. That morning, nothing made the news, not because nothing happened, but because all stations failed to broadcast for 13 minutes. Analog, digital, satellite, all dark. In their place, a single frame, a spiral, faint, almost artistic, but the texture was unmistakable. Skin. Those who noticed and remembered described the moment not as terror, but as completion, as if something that had always been missing had finally arrived. The robe had never been a warning, it had been a map, a measurement, a myth-sized tailor's dummy, stretched across a century of silence and preparation. And now, the world had been fitted, tight, quiet, willing, ready. The skin-taker no longer needed to walk, he could be worn by everyone. The dawn of January 1st, 1980, arrived not with fireworks, but with a heaviness, like a garment newly draped over the shoulders of a world unaware it had been dressed. The sun rose, but many said it felt artificial, diffused, filtered, like light pushing through gauze. Across the southwest, people emerged from sleep with soreness along their spines and bruises shaped like stitched seams wrapping their limbs. Hospitals were overwhelmed by patients complaining of phantom pressure in their chests. X-rays showed nothing, except in 37 cases, where a dense, thread-like shadow looped once around the heart and then disappeared. In rural Kansas, an early morning jogger vanished mid-stride. His wife, following his route hours later, found his clothing neatly folded at the edge of a cornfield, along with a note scrawled into the dirt with a single finger, still inside, just worn differently. But it wasn't just bodies. Language itself began to warp. In hundreds of unrelated locations, people opened their books to find words replaced. A woman in Oregon flipped through a children's Bible and found Leviticus overwritten with tanning instructions. A poet in Maine discovered his journal had filled with symbols that, when transcribed, matched a Sumerian funerary invocation. And in a Los Angeles public library, a Latin dictionary spontaneously reclassified the word vestis, garment, to mean soul. Broadcasts glitched. Voiceovers became layered, sometimes with faint whispering underneath. One late-night news anchor in Chicago finished his report on a factory fire, then paused, staring off camera for 7 seconds before saying, "He wears us as language." The broadcast abruptly cut to black. The station denied it ever aired. Thousands saw it. Then, something changed underground. In geological monitoring stations across New Mexico and Texas, seismic machines recorded a single, unified pulse. It traveled not in waves, but in coils. When plotted, the data revealed an impossibly perfect spiral, beginning beneath Sierra Blanca and looping outward across North America. Its shape matched the original layout of Sauer's robe. Its radius extended with each passing day, like a ripple in flesh. And still, no one could agree on what, if anything, had truly happened. There were no cities burned, no sky split open. But something had fundamentally shifted. Children began drawing spirals without instruction. Surgeons reported operating on tissues that seemed to resist being closed, as if preferring to remain open. And those attuned to myth, priests, poets, the mentally ill, spoke of a hum inside their bodies, not tinnitus, not hallucination, a stitching sound. One former linguist turned recluse, who had studied the robe's inscriptions obsessively, published a final letter before disappearing. In it, she wrote, "It was never about a man who wore the robe. It was about the robe teaching the world how to be worn. We are no longer observers of the myth. We are fibers in its lining." By the end of that first day of the new decade, there was no official record of what occurred. No headlines, no ceremonies. Just silence, subtle and weighty, as if the earth had exhaled and the breath had nowhere left to go. The skin taker did not return. He did not rise. He simply fit. The days that followed moved like stitched cloth, tight, slow, with every hour feeling already worn. January 1980 passed beneath an uneasy hush. The world didn't end. It adjusted. But those who paid attention, really paid attention, saw the seams. In Salt Lake City, commuters reported seeing their reflections lag slightly in windows, delayed by fractions of a second, then catching up with a faint ripple, like fabric settling on a frame. In Quebec, a pianist's right hand stiffened mid-performance, locking into a claw. Doctors said it was nerve damage, but he insisted otherwise. "It's not mine anymore," he whispered. "It's been claimed. I feel someone else wearing it." And then came the second births. Hospitals from Texas to Tennessee recorded a rash of impossible deliveries. Women who had long since had hysterectomies, postmenopausal patients, even a woman declared sterile since birth. Each case produced the same result, no child. Instead, medical staff delivered small, pulsing masses of tissue wrapped tightly in what appeared to be dried membrane, fibrous, translucent, and spiraled. When incinerated, the masses released no smoke, only a scent, copper, rot, and lye. Exactly like the air outside the Sierra Blanca tannery in 1912. In Oklahoma City, a man who had spent a decade mute after a stroke suddenly began speaking again, but not in English. Not in any known language. Linguists reviewing the tape found elements of Enochian, Basque, and Nahuatl, arranged in syntax that suggested instruction rather than speech. When played in reverse, the audio translated loosely to, "You do not need to understand the lining, you only need to hold it open." He died an hour later, smiling. Meanwhile, the seam evolved into something else. It ceased to exist as a group and began surfacing as an impulse. People with no prior connection, in cities with no reported activity, began performing rituals of their own invention, threading needles without thread, humming in Fibonacci time signatures, rearranging their furniture to mirror ancient robe schematics they had never seen. They weren't joining anything, they were remembering. And then, across the country, subtle changes emerged in the world's fabric, small, strange anomalies. A child's teeth fell out in the exact order of the robe's inscriptions. A woman's scar from childhood surgery reformed itself into a spiral without explanation. A patch of asphalt in Nevada refused to cool, remaining warm to the touch regardless of weather. Sierra Blanca remained sealed. But in seismic scans, a new depth was recorded, a pocket where none should exist, a cavity not carved by machine but by patience. And from it, a steady pulse, once every 13 minutes, like a heartbeat measured in time rather than blood. One final report surfaced from a ham radio operator in Mexico who caught a burst of faint static during a solar flare. Beneath it, a voice. No accent, no breath. It said, "He is not among us, we are inside him." The robe was not a garment, it was a blueprint, and the earth itself had begun to fold inward, measured, cut, and stitched from the inside out. By February 1980, the spiral no longer needed to be drawn, it was felt, in the quiet pauses between thoughts, in the rhythm of breath, in the tightness behind one's eyes when standing in certain doorways. Something had finished nesting and was now stretching. Psych wards across the US saw a 200% increase in admissions, not for violence, but for something stranger. Patients insisting they were not themselves anymore, that they were inside out. Many could draw the full structure of Sauer's robe without ever seeing it. Every stitch, every phrase, every patch mapped in perfect proportion. One man in Maryland begged to be skinned, screaming that, "The lining has turned to shell and I am no longer underneath it." Churches began to splinter, not from doctrine, but from silence. Congregations across the South reported services where no one spoke, yet all felt they had listened to a sermon. One priest from Missouri swore he heard the entire gospel recited inside his mind in a voice that did not pause for breath. When he awoke later, the backs of his hands bore symmetrical scars shaped like tailor's notches. He said nothing from that day forward. In global science communities, the anomalies were becoming impossible to dismiss. MRI machines began to show spontaneous, threading artifacts in scans, fine lines appearing in soft tissue, spiraling. Animals born in captivity exhibited perfectly symmetrical skin folds, as if pre-measured. A blind child in Wales began describing complex geometric patterns that, when mapped, matched the internal layout of human muscle fascia, except inverted. The world, it seemed, was no longer simply haunted by the skin taker, it was being rewritten by him. And then came the Sierra Blanca breach. On February 23, satellite imaging detected a rupture, a perfect spiral crack in the concrete seal, 5 miles across, visible only in thermal scans. The CE. Enter point radiated heat equivalent to a volcanic vent, but there was no lava, no movement, just warmth pulsing every 13 minutes. The area remained physically undisturbed. No one reported tremors. It was as if something below had peeled back the layers without touching them. What emerged was not a figure, not a monster, a feeling. Across a dozen cities at that exact moment, people collapsed into fugue states, standing, sitting, driving, all with eyes rolled back. Some smiled, some cried, some vomited. When they awoke, all drew the same shape on nearby surfaces with whatever they had: lipstick, ash, urine, blood. A spiral, not expanding, but tightening. The spiral was reversing, folding inward, a signal, a closing, and one sentence echoed across 1,000 lips in 1,000 voices, reported in dozens of languages, but always meaning the same thing. The garment is ready, the world has been worn. This was no longer a haunting or even a possession, it was completion. The skin taker had not arrived. He had finished tailoring, and now we were the robe. We were the lining turned outward, the flesh pulled taut across time itself. There would be no return to before, because before was skin uncut, and we had been measured, fitted, fastened, forever. By early March 1980, the shift was no longer symbolic, it was environmental. The earth itself began to behave like skin under pressure. In isolated regions, particularly those aligning with the outer ring of the spiral, small fissures appeared not from tectonic force, but as if peeled, the way a seamstress would open a hem. Scientists reported no seismic precursors. The cracks didn't split the ground, they unfolded it. In northern Arizona, a group of hikers stumbled upon what they believed to be a sinkhole. What they actually found was worse. A spiral trench carved into the desert floor, 10 feet deep, perfectly smooth, lined with what appeared to be stretched membrane. It trembled slightly when stepped on. Samples taken by a geologist turned gelatinous within hours and emitted the same copper-laced scent that had once haunted the Tannery Basin. Those who had tried to ignore the phenomenon began to experience bleed-through. Skeptics, scientists, atheists, those unmarked by any prior experience, now dreamed in patterns. Some saw the robe as it was once sewn, others saw it as it was now, vast, invisible, draped across continents. One man, a renowned physicist, drew a new configuration of the Higgs field after dreaming of being stitched into the ceiling of a cathedral made of skin. He disappeared 3 days later. His lab was left perfectly clean, except for a spiral drawn on the chalkboard and a skinning knife resting gently at the base of his office chair. Government documents leaked to underground networks described new terminology being used internally: cognitive seam infection, spiral recursion syndrome, collective flesh resonance. None of it mattered, because even language was changing. Written alphabets began to curl subtly inward. Digital fonts glitched, curved. Letters warped not in function, but in shape, as if pulled by invisible threads. Programmers began to report erupted codebases where semicolons appeared in spirals. AI voice models began whispering unintended phrases, always in the rhythm of 317. One model trained on historical sermons began generating messages ending in the phrase, "He wears you through us." The final blow to normalcy came not from flesh, but from sky. On March 13th, a meteorological satellite captured a pressure anomaly above the Sierra Blanca region. Not a storm, not heat, wait, something immense pressing downward, yet nothing visible. Aircraft refused to fly over the zone. Birds avoided it entirely. The clouds themselves spiraled around it in slow, reverent orbit, and on the ground, people began to bow, not to an altar, not to an idol, but to an absence, a presence only felt, like gravity tailored to human spirit. A child in Missouri, blind since birth, summed it up best when she touched the ground during one of the 317 pulses and said, "He isn't coming out, he's pulling us in." The robe had reversed, the spiral had tightened. We were no longer watching the skin taker emerge. We were being drawn inward, stitch by stitch, into the lining of something older than belief, older than death. There was no longer a question of who he was. There was only one question left: how long until he closes the seam? The final days of March blurred. They didn't pass, they folded, like pages creased in haste. Time itself began to feel stitched, as though moments were being reused, repurposed, drawn tighter with each passing breath. People stopped trusting clocks. Shadows moved ahead of their owners. Across North America, sightings of impossible figures surged. Tall, robe-like silhouettes with no visible features, only impressions, creases where mouths should be, stitched folds instead of eyes, the outline of buttons pressed into the flesh of their chests. But they did not speak, they only watched, and sometimes they gestured, a tug of the fingers, mimicking the motion of drawing thread. A series of underground broadcasts began pulsing across the AM spectrum, low-frequency hums that, when sonified into waveforms, formed concentric spirals. Cryptographers analyzing the signal claimed it wasn't a message, it was a lullaby. The tempo matched fetal heart rhythms. One recording technician miscarried while monitoring the feed, despite not knowing she was pregnant. she said before passing out. He pulled the thread too soon. Sierra Blanca was declared permanently inaccessible by federal authorities, not cordoned, not guarded, abandoned. Satellite footage showed the land itself had depressed by nearly 6 feet. What was once a sealed site now resembled a shallow basin, smooth and skin-like, as if something massive had curled beneath it, waiting to be zipped shut. Birds no longer flew over it. Storms circled it like a drain, and in a nearby town, a teacher woke to find all the chalkboards in her school filled edge to edge with a single phrase: "Do not mourn the lining, you were meant to be worn." Around the world, reports of reversed reflection became commonplace. People saw themselves smiling when they weren't. Mirrors showed movements that hadn't happened yet. One woman in Alaska covered every mirror in her home after watching herself slowly unbutton her own face. She had no memory of the act, but she remembered the sound, soft, wet, careful, like peeling back fruit. At 3:17 a.m. on March 31st, the final anomaly struck. Seismic stations across the globe recorded not an earthquake, but a pulse. A single global vibration, deep, resonant, and inexplicably warm. It didn't damage infrastructure. It didn't shake buildings, but it stopped every pacemaker in North America for exactly 13 seconds. Hundreds died. Thousands felt it. Some said it was like being held, others like being pressed between giant fingers. And then, silence. No more sightings, no more spirals, no more reports. For the first time in months, the world felt still. But survivors, those marked by dreams, by scars, by breath that didn't feel like their own, knew better. The world hadn't healed. It had simply closed. The last stitch pulled, the seam flattened. Whatever had worn the robe no longer needed to walk among us. It had become the space between us, between seconds, between skin and soul. The skin taker had finished his work. He did not rise, he did not conquer, he dressed, and we wore him beautifully. April 1980 began without dawn. The sun rose, yes, but its light arrived dimmer, slower, as though it had to press through something new before touching the earth. Skywatchers noticed it first. The clouds, once idle and soft, now moved with intention, coiling in slow, deliberate loops, as if drawn by invisible hands pulling fabric around a form. Meteorologists chalked it up to wind shear, but they didn't explain why satellite imagery began returning frames laced with a faint texture, like skin under magnification, stretched thin across the upper atmosphere. One image, scrubbed within hours of capture, showed something worse: a seam, a long curling fault line, not in the crust, but in the sky itself, stitched closed with thunderhead spirals. Those attuned to what had unfolded, those who had felt the threading from the inside, woke that month with a shared sensation. Not fear, not pain, settling, as if they'd been fastened into something vast and final, as if the world itself had become tailored, and they were no longer walking atop it but suspended within it. A nurse in Nebraska described it best. "I don't live on the earth anymore, I live in its sleeve." Across rural America, birds began building nests in perfect concentric circles, not spirals, but eyes, open, unblinking shapes, watching upward. The seam was gone, not destroyed, not dispersed, but fulfilled. Its symbols no longer appeared in chalk or blood or bone. Now they appeared in instinct, in muscle memory, in the curve of a mother's hand swaddling her child in a loop that matched the robe's pattern exactly. Churches fell quiet, not from abandonment, but from reverence. In Louisiana, a congregation gathered for Easter service and stood in silence for 90 minutes, each member weeping silently while holding their own stitched palm. No one led, no one preached, yet all left with the same message carved not into cicatrices, kin, but into memory. He is the lining now, we are the warmth, and beneath Sierra Blanca, now a gentle crater lined in pale lichen and warmth, the pulses ceased, not because the heartbeat ended, but because the body no longer needed to signal. It was complete. The garment, long in the making, long whispered through mouths and myth and marrow, had been finished, fitted, and zipped. The world hadn't ended, it had been turned inside out, and the robe, once worn by one, was now worn by all. May 1980, there were no more incidents, no more spirals in the soil, no more disappearances, no more mirrored eyes blinking out of sync, but those who had been watching, those who remembered the hum beneath their ribs, the stitching rhythm in their dreams, knew it wasn't over, it was simply seamless. The horror hadn't stopped, it had been absorbed. The strange became structure, the terror became texture. The skin taker no longer needed to haunt. He was worn too well. In cities, people went about their lives with uncanny precision, not joy, not sorrow, just smoothness. Conversations felt scripted. Laughter arrived on cue. Couples danced in parks to music that wasn't playing. A man in Chicago watched a woman trip on a cracked sidewalk, only for her to untrip, her body reversing and settling into the same step, as if a thread had been tugged to correct her motion. No one else noticed. Across the globe, languages began to converge. Regional dialects flattened, idioms vanished. A slow homogenization of tone, as though the world's voice was being brought into harmony. Linguists from multiple nations submitted reports to UNESCO describing a subtle shift in how children acquired language. They were skipping steps. They were speaking in patterns. Circular thought, non-linear syntax. One child, aged 6, wrote a poem that concluded with the phrase, "We are his hem, tight and true." And still, no one could find the robe. Sauer's original garment, lost, sold, stolen, destroyed, never resurfaced. But it didn't need to, because now every garment bore a hint of it. Designers began unknowingly recreating its silhouette. Clothing stores reported an unexplained surge in returns of jackets and coats described as too tight in the sole. Tailors in Milan, Kyoto, and Sao Paulo all independently began adding an extra inner lining to every piece they crafted, despite none recalling the decisi on to do so. And somewhere, beyond the crust, beyond the breath of time itself, something exhaled. Not in relief, not in effort, but in satisfaction. The fitting was done, the garment was warm, the world no longer asked who the skin taker had been. He was no longer a name, he was no longer a figure, he was function, and everything functioned within him. The seam had been closed, the lining turned outward, the breath of every living thing a thread, the silence between them, the stitch. Horror had not erupted, it had been tailored, perfectly, permanently. And if you ever feel the skin at the nape of your neck tighten suddenly, or if you wake with the faint scent of copper and lye in your nostrils, don't be afraid, just listen. You're not being watched, you're being worn.